The village of St. Mary Mead had dressed itself in its finest for the annual summer fete, and even the weather seemed determined to cooperate. The vicarage lawn stretched before the assembled villagers like a green carpet, dotted with white marquees and bunting that fluttered cheerfully in the gentle June breeze. It was precisely the sort of afternoon that made one grateful to be English, and in a proper English village, where the most pressing concern should have been whether Mrs. Price Ridley's sponge cake would once again win the baking competition. Miss Jane Marple sat in her customary wicker chair beneath the spreading branches of an ancient oak tree, positioned with the strategic precision of a general surveying a battlefield. To the casual observer, she appeared to be nothing more than a harmless elderly lady, her white hair neatly arranged beneath a straw hat adorned with faded blue ribbon, her fingers busy with her knitting, a delicate baby's jacket in soft pink wool that seemed to require her constant attention. But those who knew Miss Marple understood that her sharp blue eyes missed nothing, cataloguing every gesture, every expression, every telling detail of human behavior with the practiced ease of someone who had spent a lifetime studying the fascinating complexity of human nature. "Such a lovely turnout, Jane," observed Mrs. Bantry, settling herself into the adjacent chair with a satisfied sigh. "Though I must confess, the atmosphere seems rather charged today, don't you think?" Miss Marple's knitting needles continued their gentle clicking as she replied, "Indeed, Dolly. Rather like the feeling one gets before a thunderstorm. Aye, the air itself seems to be holding its breath." The comparison was more apt than either lady realized. Across the lawn, conversations carried an undertone of tension that had nothing to do with the usual village rivalries over prize-winning roses or the quality of the church choir. Today's gathering had drawn not only the usual complement of villagers, but several individuals whose presence had set tongues wagging and nerves on edge. Near the refreshment tent stood Mr. Silas Blackwood, recently returned to St. Mary Mead after an absence of nearly 20 years. He had once been the village solicitor, a position he had abandoned suddenly one winter night, leaving behind whispered rumors of impropriety and a practice that had never quite recovered from his departure. Now, at 65, as he had returned to claim his inheritance, the old Blackwood cottage on the edge of the village, and with it he had brought a leather satchel that he guarded as carefully as a miser guards his gold. "He's been asking the most peculiar questions," Mrs. Bantry continued in a lowered voice. "Mrs. Hartnell told me he visited her yesterday, inquiring about events from decades past, things that most people would prefer to forget." Miss Marple observed Mr. Blackwood with particular interest. He was a tall, spare man with silver hair and the kind of pale, intelligent eyes that seemed to see too much. As she watched, he approached Mrs. Angela Meredith, the widow of the late Dr. Meredith, who was presiding over the White Elephant stall with her characteristic vivacity. Mrs. Meredith was a handsome woman of 50, although she dressed and behaved as if she were considerably younger, and her laugh, just a touch too bright, too forced, carried clearly across the lawn. The conversation between Blackwood and Mrs. Meredith was brief but intense. Miss Marple noted how Mrs. Meredith's smile became increasingly strained, how her hands gripped the edge of the table until her knuckles showed white beneath her carefully applied powder. When Blackwood moved away, Mrs. Meredith stood perfectly still for a long moment, her face the color of chalk. "Interesting," murmured Miss Marple, her needles never pausing in their rhythm. Blackwood's next target was Mr. Thomas Cardew, the current village solicitor, a portly man with shrewd eyes and the slightly pompous manner of someone who knows rather too many of his neighbors' secrets. The two men spoke in hushed tones near the tombola, and Miss Marple observed that Mr. Cardew's usual confidence seemed to desert him entirely. His face grew flushed, and he mopped his brow repeatedly with a large handkerchief, despite the pleasant temperature. "Like watching a cat among the pigeons," Miss Marple thought to herself, remembering a similar scene from her youth when young Billy Hawthorne had returned to the village with evidence of his stepfather's embezzlement. The same atmosphere of barely controlled panic, the same desperate glances exchanged between those who shared guilty secrets. The pattern continued as Blackwood made his way methodically through the gathering. He spoke briefly with Colonel Melchett, the chief constable, whose military bearing seemed to falter under whatever Blackwood whispered to him. He approached Miss Vera Claythorne, the quiet woman who served as companion to Mrs. Meredith, and watched with apparent satisfaction as her pale face became even paler. Even young Timothy Reed, the village's brooding artist, whose debts were as well known as his talent was disputed, received a visit that left him backing away toward the edge of the lawn, his eyes wide with what could only be described as terror. "My dear Jane," Mrs. Bantry whispered urgently, "whatever can he be saying to them all? Look at poor Colonel Melchett. He looks as though he's seen a ghost." "Perhaps he has," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. "The ghosts of past indiscretions can be most troublesome when they refuse to stay properly buried." As the afternoon wore on, the tension became almost palpable. Conversations died away as Blackwood approached various groups, then only to resume in frantic whispers once he had passed. The usual cheerful bustle of the fete had given way to an atmosphere of barely suppressed anxiety, as if everyone present was waiting for some terrible revelation. It was precisely 4 o'clock when Blackwood made his way to the small wooden platform that had been erected for the afternoon's announcements. He climbed the steps with deliberate slowness, his leather satchel clutched firmly in one hand, and surveyed the assembled villagers with the satisfied expression of a man who held all the cards in a very dangerous game. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent lawn, "I've asked the vicar for permission to address you all because I believe it is time, past time, for certain truths to be revealed." A collective intake of breath swept through the crowd. Miss Marple set down her knitting and gave Blackwood her full attention, her blue eyes bright with interest. 20 years ago," Blackwood continued, "I left this village under circumstances that were, shall we say, clouded. I've spent those years gathering evidence, documenting facts, and preparing for this moment. You see, I know things about this community, about individuals in this community, that some would prefer to remain hidden forever." He patted the leather satchel meaningfully. "In here are documents, photographs, letters, proof of crimes both financial and moral that have gone unpunished for far too long. Adultery, embezzlement, fraud, blackmail, oh yes, even murder. All carefully documented, all ready to be revealed." The silence that followed was deafening. Miss Marple observed the faces around her with the focused attention of a naturalist studying specimens. Mrs. Meredith had gone white as paper. Mr. Cardew was sweating profusely despite the pleasant breeze. Colonel Melchett's hand had moved instinctively to his chest as if his heart were causing him pain. Miss Claythorne appeared to be on the verge of fainting. "However," Blackwood continued, clearly enjoying the effect of his words, "I am not an unreasonable man. I am prepared to negotiate. Private meetings can be arranged. Accommodations can be reached. After all, we are all civilized people here." He smiled then, a cold, predatory expression that transformed his face into something quite unpleasant. "I shall be in my cottage this evening, reviewing my files and determining which revelations might be of greatest interest to the authorities. I do hope some of you will find time to call upon me. We have so much to discuss." With that, he descended from the platform and walked calmly toward the gate, leaving behind a crowd of people who looked as though they had just witnessed their own execution. Miss Marple picked up her knitting once more, her fingers moving with automatic precision while her mind raced. She had seen many things in her long life, but she had rarely witnessed such a blatant display of malicious intent. Silas Blackwood had not returned to St. Mary Mead for his inheritance. He had returned for revenge. "Rather like poking a hornet's nest," she murmured to herself, thinking of a similar incident years ago when the choir boys had discovered a wasp's nest in the vestry. They simply couldn't resist poking it until the inevitable happened. As the crowd began to disperse, conversations resuming in hushed, urgent tones, Miss Marple remained in her chair beneath the oak tree. The afternoon was still beautiful. The bunting still fluttered cheerfully in the breeze, but the innocence of the day had been shattered as surely as if a stone had been thrown through a stained-glass window. She was not surprised, therefore, when Dr. Haydock appeared at her side shortly after 9 o'clock that evening, his face grim in the light of the lantern he carried. "Miss Marple," he said without preamble, his voice heavy with portent, "I'm afraid there's been a tragedy. Silas Blackwood has been found dead in his cottage, and from the look of things, it wasn't natural causes." Miss Marple set down her knitting and looked up at him with eyes that held no surprise, only a deep, weary understanding of human nature in all its darkness and complexity. "I see," she said quietly. "Yes, I rather thought something of this sort might happen. Fear is such a powerful motivator, Doctor, and when people are desperate enough, they become capable of almost anything." She rose from her chair with the careful movements of age, but her mind was already sharp and focused, beginning to sort through the events of the afternoon like a scholar organizing a complex manuscript. "You had better tell me everything," she continued, reaching for her shawl. "Every detail, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. For I suspect, Doctor, that before this matter is resolved, that we shall discover that the truth is far more complicated than it appears, and far more dangerous than poor Mr. Blackwood ever imagined." The peaceful village of St. Mary Mead would not sleep easily that night. Murder had come to call, bringing with it the necessity of examining secrets that had been buried for 20 years, and the terrible knowledge that one among them was a killer who would stop at nothing to keep the past where it belonged, safely in the grave. News travels in cities by telephone and in villages by feet, though in St. Mary Mead it seemed to move by a mysterious atmospheric osmosis, particular to English communities. By the time the milkman had finished his rounds at 8 o'clock, the essential facts of Silas Blackwood's demise were known to every household. By 9, when the shops opened their doors, the rumors had undergone their first gentle improvements. Miss Marple positioned herself strategically outside the draper's shop, ostensibly examining a display of summer fabrics, while conducting what she privately termed a social reconnaissance. The transformation of the village was remarkable. Yesterday's terrified tension had given way to something far more complex and infinitely more revealing. At the post office, Miss Hartnell was holding court before a captive audience. "Mark my words," she declared with absolute conviction. "It was Thomas Cardew. Everyone saw how agitated he became when Blackwood spoke to him. Solicitors have access to their clients' most intimate secrets. What if Blackwood discovered embezzlement?" "But surely Mr. Cardew is far too respectable," ventured Mrs. Bantry. "Respectability is often just a mask." "My dear," Miss Hartnell replied darkly, "the most dangerous criminals are those who appear most trustworthy." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked thoughtfully. In her experience, it was rarely the quiet ones who committed murder. They lacked the necessary desperation. It was far more often those who appeared most integrated into society, who harbored the darkest secrets. Outside the butcher's shop, she encountered Colonel Melchett, whose usually ruddy complexion had taken on a grayish tinge. "Terrible business, Miss Marple," he said, touching his hat. Inspector Slack found Blackwood struck down with a brass candlestick. The killer left it right beside the body, almost as if they wanted to be caught. "Or wanted us to think they wanted to be caught," Miss Marple suggested gently. "I understand Blackwood spoke to you at the fete." Melchett's face flushed. "Nothing of consequence. Ancient history. Certainly nothing that would drive me to murder. I wasn't suggesting anything, Colonel. Merely gathering information." What fascinated Miss Marple most was not what people were saying, but what they were carefully avoiding. No one mentioned the leather satchel's contents. No one asked what had become of Blackwood's threatened documents, and no one seemed willing to admit they might have visited his cottage the previous evening. At the fishmonger's, Mrs. Price Ridley was announcing to her audience, "Beaten to death with a blunt instrument. Mark my words, it was a tramp. We are none of us safe in our beds." I heard it was a London gang," added Miss Hartnell, her weather-beaten face flushed with excitement. Criminal underworld, doubtless." "Actually," Miss Marple put in softly, "I believe Dr. Haydock mentioned the door was locked from the inside. That would suggest the poor man knew his attacker." The ladies fell momentarily silent, accuracy having intruded upon their theories. Further down the high street, Miss Marple observed Mrs. Angela Meredith emerging from the greengrocer's. The widow, who yesterday had looked ready to faint, now wore a bright yellow dress and hummed a cheerful tune, her basket overflowing with expensive hothouse grapes. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Mrs. Meredith called, her voice trilling too high. "Isn't it glorious? I've decided to host a bridge evening tomorrow. One must keep one's spirits up." "How very resilient," Miss Marple murmured, noting the tremor in the woman's hands that belied her cheerful demeanor. "After such a shock." "Shock? Oh yes, terrible. But life goes on, doesn't it?" Mrs. Meredith hurried away, her laughter trailing like a fractured bell. Near his office, Thomas Cardew was greeting Colonel Melchett with excessive vigor. "Terrible business," Cardew announced loudly enough for passers-by to hear, "but clearly a robbery. Blackwood flashed that satchel around like a fool. I was at my club all evening, thank heavens." "Quite right," Melchett boomed, though his eyes darted nervously. "I was in my study." "Heard nothing." Miss Marple paused by the antique shop window, appearing to study a porcelain shepherdess. How fascinating that yesterday these people had faced ruin, and today, with their accuser dead and his evidence presumably stolen, they were performing elaborate pantomimes of normalcy. They were too loud, too bright, and too eager to establish their whereabouts. The village was reacting exactly as an organism does when a foreign body is removed. The wound was closing, the white blood cells of gossip were swarming, and the survivors were rushing to embrace safety that was, she suspected, entirely illusory. "They are all so relieved he is dead," she whispered to the porcelain shepherdess, "and that is a very dangerous way to feel." Everyone had a story ready. Everyone had an alibi, and that, Miss Marple knew from long experience with human nature, was the most suspicious detail of all. Inspector Slack arrived in St. Mary Mead with the confidence of a man who had solved countless crimes by applying logic, procedure, and a healthy skepticism toward village eccentrics who fancied themselves detectives. He stood in the doorway of Blackwood Cottage, his substantial frame blocking the morning light, while Dr. Haydock completed his examination of the scene. "Straightforward robbery gone wrong," Slack announced, consulting his notebook with satisfaction. "Victim surprised the intruder, put up a fight, got his skull cracked for the trouble. The satchel's missing. That tells us everything we need to know." Miss Marple, who had arrived ostensibly to deliver a jar of preserves to the deceased's housekeeper, lingered near the garden gate with the patient persistence of someone accustomed to being overlooked. "How very unfortunate," she murmured. "Though I do wonder about the tea service, Inspector." Slack followed her gaze to the low table beside the fireplace, where a silver tray held the remnants of an interrupted social call, and 2 cups sat on delicate saucers, one bearing the telltale crescent of lipstick, now cold and abandoned, the other full of untouched tea that had long since grown bitter. "So he had a visitor," Slack said dismissively. "Probably let the killer in himself. These village types are too trusting for their own good." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, though her sharp blue eyes continued their methodical inventory of the room. The cottage was modest but meticulously maintained, every surface dusted, every book aligned. Yet now papers lay scattered across the floor in deliberate disorder. Drawers hung open like gaping mouths, and the leather satchel sat empty on the writing desk, its brass clasps gleaming mockingly in the morning light. What struck Miss Marple most forcefully was not what had been disturbed, but what remained untouched. And the bookshelf stood perfectly ordered, its volumes undisturbed. A small dish of coins on the mantelpiece had been ignored entirely. Even the desk drawers, though ransacked, still contained items of obvious value: a gold watch, several banknotes, a silver letter opener. Rather selective burglary, she observed quietly to Dr. Haydock as they stepped outside. "And that fireplace, do you notice the smell of burned leather? Fresh ash, too." The doctor nodded grimly. "Someone destroyed evidence. The question is whether they found what they were looking for first." Miss Marple's morning constitutional took her past the vicarage, where Griselda was serving tea to what appeared to be half the village. The vicar's wife possessed that invaluable quality of inspiring confidences without seeming to seek them. And this morning, her drawing room had become an impromptu gathering place for St. Mary Mead's most agitated residents. "Jane, thank heavens," Griselda whispered as Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea. "I've had the most extraordinary parade of visitors, each more nervous than the last." Mrs. Meredith arrived first, chattering about bridge parties and absolutely refusing to discuss poor Mr. Blackwood. Then Mr. Cardew came, ostensibly about church accounts, but he kept asking whether anyone had mentioned seeing him yesterday evening. Miss Marple's knitting needles began their gentle rhythm. All establishing their whereabouts, I suppose. Precisely. And Colonel Melchett made a special point of mentioning he'd been home all evening, working on his memoirs. Even Miss Claythorne stopped by, you know how quiet she usually is, and talked for 20 minutes about absolutely nothing. The weather, the garden, the price of butter. It was as if she couldn't bear to be alone with her thoughts. Through the vicarage window, Miss Marple observed the village green, where Timothy Reed stood beside the war memorial with a sketch pad. Yet his charcoal remained motionless, his attention fixed not on his supposed subject, but on the front door of Cardew's office across the street. When Mrs. Meredith emerged from the solicitor's office, walking with uncharacteristic haste and clutching her handbag like a lifeline, Reed turned away abruptly, feigning absorption in his work. "How very interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "They are not mourning, Griselda. They are calculating." The pattern became clearer as the morning progressed. These were not the reactions of innocent people shocked by tragedy, but of conspirators who no longer trusted one another. Yesterday, they had been united by their common fear of Silas Blackwood's revelations. Today, with that threat removed, the alliance had fractured into something far more dangerous: mutual suspicion. Near the post office, Miss Marple encountered Miss Claythorne, who was scrubbing a pair of gardening gloves with unnecessary vigor, her pale face set in lines of grim concentration. When the postman greeted her cheerfully, she jumped so violently that she dropped the gloves into a puddle. "Everyone's nerves are quite shattered," the postman observed to Miss Marple. "Can't say I blame them. I was with a murderer loose in the village." But Miss Marple knew it was more than nerves. It was the terrible isolation that comes when a shared secret transforms into individual guilt. Yesterday, Blackwood's threats had bound his victims together in common cause. Today, each wondered if the person standing beside them was the one who had struck the fatal blow. The evidence painted a clear picture for those willing to see it. The tea service proved Blackwood had welcomed his killer as a guest. The untouched cup suggested their conversation had been interrupted before it properly began. Perhaps by an argument, perhaps by the sudden recognition of murderous intent. The locked cottage confirmed the intimacy of the encounter, while the ransacked room and burned documents indicated a desperate search for incriminating evidence. Most tellingly, the weapon itself, a brass candlestick left beside the body, seemed almost theatrical in its obviousness. In Miss Marple's long experience with human nature, real murders were rarely so conveniently staged. This felt like misdirection, a deliberate attempt to suggest robbery when the true motive lay buried in the complex web of secrets that connected St. Mary Mead's most respectable citizens. As she walked slowly home, Miss Marple reflected on the curious dance of guilt now playing out across the village. Inspector Slack would pursue his robbery theory with methodical determination, interviewing suspects and checking alibis. But the real investigation would happen in drawing rooms and garden parties, in the spaces between words and the glances that weren't quite exchanged. Someone in St. Mary Mead had committed murder to protect a secret. So now they were discovering that killing the blackmailer had only created a more dangerous problem. For in a village where everyone watched everyone else, the murderer's greatest enemy was not the police, but the growing certainty that their fellow conspirators knew exactly who had blood on their hands. Inspector Slack had always prided himself on methodical police work, and by Wednesday morning he had arranged his facts with the satisfaction of a man assembling a particularly challenging jigsaw puzzle. The obvious pieces were falling into place with gratifying regularity, and he saw no reason to complicate matters by looking for more exotic solutions. The net Titan's Timothy Reed had emerged as the investigation's natural focal point, a development that surprised no one in St. Mary Mead except Miss Marple, and the young artist possessed all the requisite qualifications for guilt: financial desperation, a volatile temperament, and the sort of bohemian lifestyle that made respectable villagers shake their heads knowingly. More damning still, the evidence against him was mounting with each passing hour. Mrs. Price Ridley had reported seeing Reed near Blackwood's cottage at approximately 8 o'clock on the evening of the murder, walking with what she described as furtive determination. The postmistress confirmed he had posted a letter just after 7, but that left a crucial gap in his timeline. Most incriminating of all, a search of the dustbin behind his studio had revealed fragments of burnt leather and brass fittings that matched the description of Blackwood's missing satchel. "Open and shut," Inspector Slack announced to Colonel Melchett, consulting his notebook with evident satisfaction. Reed had motive, gambling debts that Blackwood was threatening to expose to his wealthy aunt. He had opportunity. No alibi for the crucial hours. And now we have physical evidence linking him to the crime scene. Miss Marple, who had arrived at the vicarage ostensibly to discuss flower arrangements with Griselda, listened to this recitation with the polite attention of someone hearing a familiar but unconvincing story. "How very thorough," she murmured, her knitting needles clicking gently. "Though I do wonder about the tea service. 2 cups suggest a social visit, don't they, Mr.? Reed strikes me as the sort of young man who would simply demand entry rather than accepting an invitation for refreshments." Cracks in the foundation. Slack's certainty began to show hairline fractures when he turned his attention to the other suspects. Thomas Cardew's alibi, that he had spent the evening at his club in Much Benham, proved to be entirely fabricated. The club porter confirmed that the solicitor had not signed in that evening, and further investigation revealed he had been seen near Blackwood's cottage shortly after 9 o'clock. Under pressure, Cardew admitted to visiting the deceased, but only to plead for the return of certain documents related to a client's confidential affairs. "I left him alive and well at 9:30, he insisted, his usual pomposity replaced by haggard desperation. "We discussed terms, nothing more. I had no reason to harm him." Mrs. Angela Meredith's story proved equally fragile upon examination. Her claim that she had spent the evening playing cards with Miss Claythorne was supported by her companion, but several neighbors reported seeing a cloaked figure hurrying along the lane toward Blackwood's cottage well after 10 o'clock. When pressed, Mrs. Meredith became increasingly agitated, her bright social manner cracking to reveal something altogether more fragile beneath. Even Colonel Melchett's account of a quiet evening working on his memoirs began to seem suspiciously convenient when his housekeeper mentioned that he had burned a substantial quantity of papers in the garden incinerator at dawn, claiming they were old military records of no importance. The village watches, the atmosphere insane. The Mary Mead had grown increasingly charged as the investigation progressed. What had begun as shocked sympathy for the victim had transformed into something more complex and dangerous, a collective holding of breath, as if the entire village was waiting for some terrible revelation. Miss Marple observed this transformation with the keen interest of a naturalist studying a disturbed ecosystem. The usual patterns of village life had been disrupted, replaced by whispered conversations that ceased abruptly when outsiders approached and glances that carried the weight of shared secrets. "They are all acting guilty," she confided to Mrs. Bantry as they walked past the post office, where a cluster of residents had gathered to dissect the latest developments. But not guilty of murder, I think. Guilty of something else entirely, something that connects them all. The realization struck her with sudden clarity. These people were not simply afraid of being accused of murder. They were afraid of each other. The death of Silas Blackwood had not eliminated their problems, but had created new and more dangerous ones. Someone among them was a killer, and the others knew it. A quiet voice speaks. It was during her afternoon constitutional that Miss Marple encountered the one person who had remained curiously silent throughout the village's collective hysteria. Miss Vera Claythorne was tending the flowers in the churchyard, her pale hands moving with practiced efficiency among the memorial wreaths. "Such dedicated work," Miss Marple observed, approaching with the careful steps of age. "The flowers are beautifully maintained." Miss Claythorne started violently, dropping her trowel with a clatter that seemed unnaturally loud in the peaceful churchyard. "Oh, Miss Marple, you startled me." "My apologies, dear. I was admiring your handiwork. You have such a gentle touch with growing things." The younger woman's hands were trembling as she retrieved her tool. "I find gardening soothing. It helps one forget unpleasant things." Miss Marple settled herself on a nearby bench, her knitting appearing as if by magic in her hands. "Yes, the village has been quite overwrought, though I do feel the police may be looking in the wrong direction with poor Mr. Reed, and Mr. Cardew for that matter." The effect of these words on Miss Claythorne was immediate and startling. Her pale face went white as chalk, and her eyes darted to Miss Marple's face with undisguised terror. You think they're innocent." "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that a cautious man like Silas Blackwood would not have invited just anyone into his home for tea. The evidence suggests he knew his killer quite well, trusted them enough to serve refreshments and discuss business. Someone he believed he could control, perhaps. Someone he underestimated." For a fleeting moment, something shifted in Miss Claythorne's expression. The terrified companion vanished, replaced by a woman with eyes as cold and calculating as winter ice. Then, just as quickly, the mask of frightened civility returned. "I really must go," she stammered, gathering her gardening tools with hands that shook like autumn leaves. "Mrs. Meredith will be wondering where I am." The pattern emerges. As Miss Marple watched the young woman hurry away, her mind began to arrange the pieces of the puzzle in a new and more disturbing pattern. The police were pursuing the obvious suspects, men with loud motives and broken alibis, whose guilt seemed to announce itself with every nervous gesture and contradictory statement. But the tea service told a different story. 2 cups, one bearing the telltale crescent of lipstick. Neither Timothy Reed nor Thomas Cardew wore cosmetics. The killer had been a woman whom Blackwood had trusted enough to invite into his home, confident in his ability to manipulate and control her. The revelation brought with it a new understanding of the village's collective anxiety. They were not simply hiding their own secrets. No, they were protecting someone whose crime had freed them all from Blackwood's threats. The conspiracy was not one of guilt, but of gratitude and of growing fear that their protector might not be as safe as they had hoped. Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm as she contemplated the delicate web of loyalty and terror that had settled over St. Mary Mead like morning mist. Inspector Slack would continue his methodical pursuit of the obvious suspects, building cases against men whose very obviousness proclaimed their innocence. But the real killer walked among them still, protected by the silence of those who owed her their freedom and growing more dangerous with each passing hour. The truth, as Miss Marple had learned long ago, was rarely found in the loudest protests of innocence or the most dramatic displays of guilt, and it lived in the quiet spaces between words, in the glances that weren't quite exchanged, and in the trembling hands of a woman who tended flowers in a churchyard and carried secrets darker than the earth she disturbed. The breakthrough came in the form of a charred photograph fragment, discovered by the church gardener while clearing debris from behind Blackwood's cottage. Inspector Slack examined it with professional satisfaction. Here, finally, was tangible evidence to support his methodical approach to the case. The partial image showed two figures before what appeared to be a seaside hotel. The woman's face had been deliberately burned away, but the man was unmistakably Dr. Edmund Meredith, Angela Meredith's late husband. The photograph's date stamp read August 1999, just 3 months before the doctor's supposedly accidental drowning. Miss Marple studied the fragment when Griselda brought it to her attention, noting details that Inspector Slack had dismissed. The woman's hand rested possessively on Dr. Meredith's arm, and her clothing suggested youth and a certain bohemian disregard for convention. More significantly, Dr. Meredith was supposed to have been attending a medical conference in Edinburgh that August, a fact Mrs. Meredith had emphasized repeatedly to anyone who would listen. The discovery sent tremors through the village's carefully maintained facade of normalcy. Mrs. Meredith, when confronted, became hysterical, her social veneer shattering like dropped china. Yes, she admitted between sobs. She had known about Edmund's affair. Yes, Blackwood had threatened to reveal details about her husband's death that might prompt authorities to re-examine the circumstances. But no, she insisted. She had not killed anyone. She had been playing cards with Miss Claythorne all evening. Miss Claythorne confirmed this alibi with mechanical precision, reciting details with the suspicious smoothness of a well-rehearsed performance. They had played whist from 7 until 11, she stated, never leaving the drawing room except briefly for refreshments. Mrs. Meredith had won 3 shillings and 6pence, which she could prove by showing the coins still in her purse. Miss Marple listened to these recitations with the patient attention of someone watching amateur theatrics. In her experience, genuine memories contained gaps and uncertainties, and while fabricated ones possessed the polished perfection of rehearsed lines. She had observed this phenomenon before, in cases where accomplices provided each other with flawless alibis that were too perfect to be believable. The photograph's revelation created a cascade of confessions that threatened to overwhelm Inspector Slack's methodical investigation. Thomas Cardew, sensing shifting winds, admitted to visiting Blackwood but claimed to have seen another figure leaving through the garden gate. Someone with a distinctive limping gait that pointed directly to Colonel Melchett. When confronted, the colonel's military bearing finally collapsed. He had visited Blackwood to discuss letters that suggested wartime cowardice, accusations that were false but would destroy his reputation if made public. He arrived at 10 o'clock, he claimed, to find Blackwood already dead. Panicking, he had searched for the letters, failed to find them, and fled without reporting the crime. Timothy Reed, meanwhile, had broken down entirely under questioning, admitting to his visit, but swearing he had left Blackwood alive. The young artist's desperation was genuine, his fear palpable, but Miss Marple noted one crucial detail in his confession. Blackwood had barely let him inside, conducting their brief, heated conversation at the doorway. There had been no invitation for tea, no social pleasantries, just harsh words and Reed's angry departure. Each confession seemed to complicate rather than clarify the investigation. Multiple visitors, each with compelling motives, each claiming to have found Blackwood dead or left him alive. The timeline was becoming impossibly crowded, like a drawing room farce where too many characters attempted to occupy the same space simultaneously. Miss Marple sat in her cottage that evening, her knitting abandoned as she contemplated the day's revelations. The confessions troubled her, not because they revealed guilt, but because they revealed something far more dangerous, a coordinated effort to obscure the truth through an abundance of half-truths. The tea service remained her anchor in this sea of deception. 2 cups suggested a social visit, one bearing the telltale crescent of lipstick indicating a woman guest. But which woman? Mrs. Meredith claimed an alibi supported by Miss Claythorne, while Miss Claythorne herself had no independent verification of her whereabouts. What struck Miss Marple most forcefully was the calculated nature of these confessions. Instead of maintaining innocence, each suspect was admitting to presence, to motive, to opportunity, everything except the actual murder. It was as if someone had orchestrated this confusion, understanding that the investigation would become paralyzed by an embarrassment of suspects rather than a lack of them. "Everyone is confessing," she murmured to herself, "but someone is directing the chorus." The realization chilled her more than the evening air. The killer had not simply committed murder and hoped to escape detection. They had created a deliberate maze of guilt and misdirection, using the very desperation of their fellow conspirators as camouflage for their own crime. Somewhere in this tangle of confessions and alibis lay the truth, but it would require more than Inspector Slack's methodical approach to uncover it, and it would require understanding the psychology of someone clever enough to hide in plain sight, using others' guilt as a shield for their own far more terrible secret. The morning brought an unexpected shift in the investigation's trajectory, though not in the direction Inspector Slack had anticipated. Dr. Haydock arrived at Miss Marple's cottage with information that cast doubt on the carefully constructed timeline that had emerged from the previous day's confessions. "The medical evidence doesn't support their stories, Jane," he said without preamble, settling into her small parlor with the weary air of a man who had spent the night reviewing his findings. "Rigor mortis, body temperature, stomach contents, all point to death occurring much earlier than anyone admits. 9 o'clock, perhaps half past at the latest. Not the parade of visits they're all describing." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in their rhythm. So the succession of callers found him already dead. "Or never visited at all," Haydock replied grimly, "which raises the question of why they're so eager to place themselves at the scene of a murder." The answer to that puzzle began to emerge when Miss Marple paid a visit to Mrs. Turner, Blackwood's housekeeper, under the pretext of discussing funeral flowers. The gaunt woman proved surprisingly forthcoming about her former employer's final day. "He was particularly excited that evening," Mrs. Turner recalled, her sharp features softening slightly with memory. "Said he was expecting a lady for tea. Wanted the good china, the silver service. 'She'll come quiet,' he said. 'Not wanting to be seen. Made me lay everything out proper at 10 to 8, then sent me home early.'" "A lady," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "Did he mention which lady?" "No, but he was pleased with himself, something fierce. Kept saying he had insurance now, that some folk thought they were cleverer than they were." Mrs. Turner's voice dropped to a whisper. "And he did something strange, Miss Marple. Took a second key from his desk drawer and put it in his waistcoat pocket. Said it was for safekeeping." This detail proved illuminating when combined with another discovery made by Mrs. Bantry during her morning constitutional. The chemist, Mr. Abernathy, had mentioned in passing that someone had been asking about digitalist prescriptions, not for heart conditions, but for their general effects and dosage requirements. "Most unusual," Mrs. Bantry reported over tea. He said the person seemed particularly interested in how quickly it worked and whether it could be detected afterward. Rather morbid curiosity, don't you think? Miss Marple found herself contemplating the pattern that was emerging. The tea service suggested a social visit with someone Blackwood trusted enough to entertain properly. The early time of death indicated this visit had occurred before the parade of desperate confessors, and the inquiry about digitalists suggested someone had been planning a very different sort of murder, one that would have appeared natural. "A change of plan," she murmured to herself, remembering similar cases from her past. The poison failed, or was discovered, forcing improvisation. The afternoon brought news that sent fresh tremors through the village. Miss Vera Claythorne had been found at the railway station, attempting to board the early train to London with a single suitcase and wearing what appeared to be every piece of jewelry she owned. When intercepted by Inspector Slack, She had immediately confessed to Blackwood's murder. Her confession was remarkably detailed, too detailed, Miss Marple thought when she heard it recounted. Miss Claythorne described the candlestick, the struggle, even the methodical search for documents afterward. But when Miss Marple requested a brief interview at the police station, certain inconsistencies became apparent. "The lipstick on the teacup," Miss Marple mentioned gently. "You don't wear cosmetics, do you, my dear?" Miss Claythorne's composed facade flickered. That evening I borrowed some of Mrs. Meredith's rouge. For courage." "I see. And what shade was it?" "Mrs. Meredith is quite particular about her cosmetics." The silence that followed was more revealing than any answer. Miss Claythorne's hands twisted in her lap, and her eyes held the desperate look of someone trapped by their own fabrication. "You weren't there, were you?" Miss Marple continued softly. "Someone else shared tea with Mr. Blackwood that evening. Someone who does wear lipstick, someone he trusted enough to invite into his home. You're protecting them, but I wonder if they're worth such a sacrifice." The mask of resignation cracked, revealing raw terror beneath. "You don't understand," Miss Claythorne whispered. "If I don't confess, they'll—" She stopped abruptly, as if realizing she had revealed too much. Walking home through the village streets, Miss Marple reflected on the curious performance she had witnessed. The desperate confessions, the false alibis, the theatrical placement of evidence, all of it orchestrated by someone who understood human nature well enough to manipulate fear into complicity. The real killer had not simply committed murder, they had staged an elaborate drama in which the entire village played unwitting roles. They had turned victims into accomplices, using the same techniques Blackwood himself had employed, the power of hidden secrets to bend people to one's will. But like all performances, this one contained flaws visible to the trained observer. The medical timeline, the unused poison, the lipstick on the teacup. Each detail told a story different from the one being performed on St. Mary Mead's stage. Miss Marple quickened her pace slightly, her mind already working on the next act of this deadly drama. The killer believed themselves safe, hidden behind a wall of false confessions and misdirection. But they had made one crucial error. They had underestimated an elderly lady who had spent a lifetime watching human nature reveal itself in the smallest, most telling details. The evening brought with it the kind of gentle rain that transforms an English village into something from a watercolor painting, each lighted window glowing warmly against the gathering dusk. Mrs. Angela Meredith had insisted on proceeding with her promised bridge party, declaring with brittle determination that life must go on, mustn't it? Her drawing room, with its tasteful furnishings and carefully arranged flowers, presented an image of genteel normalcy that fooled no one present. But the performance begins. Miss Marple had declined the invitation, pleading a mild headache, but her absence seemed to make the remaining players, Thomas Cardew, Colonel Melchett, and Griselda, more nervous rather than less. Mrs. Meredith shuffled the cards with hands that trembled despite her efforts at control, her bright chatter filling the silences that threatened to expose the underlying tension. "Such a relief about poor Miss Claythorne," she announced, dealing cards that scattered slightly from her unsteady grip. "Dreadful business, of course, but at least we have answers now. The poor dear was always so highly strung. I should have seen the signs." Griselda, whose sharp eyes missed little, noticed the silver tea service gleaming on the side table. "What a lovely set, Angela. Is it new?" "Oh, I've had it for years," Mrs. Meredith replied too quickly, her voice rising a half-tone. "Edmund gave it to me after we married. He always had such exquisite taste." The mention of her late husband cast a momentary shadow over the room. Colonel Melchett cleared his throat uncomfortably, while Cardew's hand shook as he arranged his cards. The bridge game proceeded fitfully, conversations dying mid-sentence and resuming in frantic whispers about anything except the obvious topic that dominated everyone's thoughts. It was during the second rubber that the maid entered with a note on a silver tray. "For you, madam." From Miss Marple. Mrs. Meredith's hand hovered for a heartbeat before taking the folded paper. She opened it with affected casualness, but the color drained from her face as she read the single line written in Miss Marple's careful script. "You do wear crimson rose, I think. Such a distinctive shade for China." Her fingers tightened, crumpling the paper. The silence stretched until it became unbearable, broken only by the gentle patter of rain against the windows. "Bad news," Cardew ventured, his voice carefully neutral. "Nothing of importance," Mrs. Meredith managed, but her hands were shaking so violently that the cards scattered across the table like frightened birds. Shall we finish the rubber?" The mask slips. By morning, the carefully constructed facade had crumbled entirely. Mrs. Angela Meredith was found by her housekeeper, and barely conscious in her drawing room with an empty bottle of sleeping tablets beside her and a hastily scrawled note that read, "I cannot let an innocent woman suffer for my sins." Dr. Haydock's examination revealed what Miss Marple had suspected. The suicide attempt was carefully timed, the dosage calculated to cause alarm rather than death. Mrs. Meredith had taken the tablets just before her housekeeper was due to arrive, ensuring discovery and rescue. Inspector Slack, faced with a second confession that contradicted his first arrest, was predictably frustrated. "They're making a mockery of the law," he complained to Colonel Melchett. "First the companion confesses, now the mistress attempts suicide and claims responsibility. How am I supposed to determine which confession is genuine?" But Miss Marple, studying the ambiguous wording of Mrs. Meredith's note, saw something else entirely. The confession spoke of sins rather than murder specifically, and the timing suggested desperation rather than genuine guilt. Someone was orchestrating this chaos, using the village's collective fear to create an elaborate smokescreen. The deeper truth. Miss Marple's afternoon was spent in the village library, poring over old newspaper archives with the assistance of young Miss Prynne. Her search was methodical and patient, guided by a growing certainty that the key to understanding Blackwood's murder lay not in the present, but in events from 20 years past. The revelation, when it came, was both illuminating and chilling. Buried in the archives was a small article from August 1999 about a tragic accident at a seaside hotel in Devon, and a young woman had fallen from a cliff path during a violent storm. The verdict was accidental death. Her name was Mary Blackwood, Silas Blackwood's estranged daughter, the child he had abandoned when he fled St. Mary Mead in disgrace. The pieces of the puzzle began to arrange themselves with terrifying clarity. The photograph fragment showing Dr. Meredith with an unknown woman, the date stamp proving the doctor's presence in Devon when he was supposed to be at a medical conference, the systematic nature of Blackwood's investigation, all of it pointed to a truth far darker than simple blackmail. Silas Blackwood had not returned to St. Mary Mead for money or revenge against old enemies. He had returned as a father seeking justice for his daughter's death, convinced that her accident was murder and determined to identify her killer among the people she had known and trusted. The web of deception. This revelation transformed Miss Marple's understanding of everything that had followed. The killer was not simply eliminating a blackmailer to hide financial crimes or moral indiscretions. They were killing to conceal a previous murder, using the village's collective guilt and fear to create an elaborate web of false confessions and misdirection. The systematic manipulation became clear. Miss Claythorne's coached confession, Mrs. Meredith's theatrical suicide attempt, the planted evidence in Timothy Reed's dustbin, even the parade of visitors claiming to have found Blackwood already dead. And all of it had been orchestrated by someone with an intimate understanding of human psychology and the patience to execute a complex deception. Miss Marple thought of the lipstick on the teacup, the early time of death that contradicted all the supposed visits, and the inquiry about digitalists that suggested an abandoned plan for a more subtle murder. The killer had adapted when circumstances changed, improvising brilliantly while maintaining control over the narrative that followed. The final understanding. As she walked home through the rain-washed streets of St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected on the profound evil she was confronting. This was not a crime of passion or desperation, but the calculated work of someone who had killed once and was willing to kill again to protect their secret. Someone who could manipulate others into confessing to crimes they hadn't committed, who could watch the chaos they created with cold detachment, and who possessed the intelligence to stay hidden while others destroyed themselves, trying to protect them. The question was no longer who had the opportunity or motive to kill Silas Blackwood. The question was who among the village's residents possessed the combination of medical knowledge, psychological insight, and ruthless calculation necessary to orchestrate this elaborate deception. Someone who had been in Devon 20 years ago, someone who knew Mary Blackwood well enough to be involved in her death, and someone who had spent 2 decades perfecting the art of appearing innocent while others suffered for their crimes. Miss Marple quickened her pace slightly, and her mind already working on the approach for tomorrow's confrontation. The killer believed themselves safe, hidden behind a wall of false confessions and manufactured evidence. But they had made one crucial error. They had underestimated an elderly lady who had spent a lifetime studying human nature in all its complexity, and who understood that the most dangerous criminals were often those who appeared most innocent. The time had come for the final test, the gentle pressure that would cause even the most carefully constructed mask to slip and reveal the face of a killer who had thought themselves beyond the reach of justice. The morning brought with it the kind of oppressive stillness that precedes a thunderstorm, and Miss Marple felt the weight of accumulated secrets pressing down upon St. Mary Mead like a physical force. No, she had spent the night in careful contemplation, arranging the pieces of her theory with the methodical precision of someone assembling a particularly complex puzzle. Now came the delicate task of testing that theory without revealing her hand too early. The gathering. Her invitation to a small discussion about recent events had been accepted with varying degrees of reluctance by the key players in what had become the village's most perplexing murder case. The vicarage drawing room, with its comfortable furnishings and air of gentle respectability, provided the perfect neutral ground for what Miss Marple privately termed her final examination. Inspector Slack occupied a chair near the door, his notebook at the ready and his expression skeptical. Colonel Melchett sat stiffly upright, and his military bearing intact despite the strain of recent events. Dr. Haydock stood by the window, his medical bag at his feet, a precaution Miss Marple had quietly requested. Mrs. Meredith had arrived pale but composed, her recent suicide attempt having failed to resolve anything. Miss Claythorne sat beside her, released from custody but clearly terrified. Thomas Cardew completed the gathering, his usual pomposity replaced by nervous caution. "So kind of you all to come," Miss Marple began, her knitting needles clicking with their familiar rhythm. "I felt we simply must clarify certain matters before any more innocent people suffer for crimes they didn't commit." The effect of these words was immediate. Several people shifted uncomfortably, and Miss Marple noted each reaction with the trained eye of someone who had spent a lifetime studying human nature. The medical evidence. Dr. Haydock has been most helpful in establishing the timeline, she continued conversationally. The medical evidence shows quite clearly that Mr. Blackwood died much earlier than anyone has admitted to visiting him. Around 9 o'clock, perhaps even earlier. This means that all those anxious confessions about finding him dead or leaving him alive were simply impossible. Inspector Slack consulted his notebook with renewed interest. So they were all lying. "Not lying, necessarily," Miss Marple replied gently, "but perhaps guided. You see, when people are desperate to hide one's secret, they can be manipulated into admitting to others. Someone has been very clever about using fear as a weapon." She observed the faces around her with particular attention. Mrs. Meredith had gone pale, while Miss Claythorne seemed to shrink further into her chair. But there were other reactions too. Quick glances exchanged, hands that trembled slightly, The kind of subtle tells that revealed more than any spoken confession. The Devon connection. "I've been thinking about that photograph fragment," Miss Marple continued, her voice maintaining its gentle conversational tone. "The one showing Dr. Meredith with an unknown young woman. The date was August 1999, and the location was clearly a seaside hotel in Devon." The silence that followed was profound. Miss Marple allowed it to stretch, watching as the implications settled over her audience like a slowly descending fog. The young woman was Mary Blackwood, Silas Blackwood's daughter. She died 3 days after that photograph was taken, supposedly an accident during a violent storm. But her father never believed it was accidental, and he spent 20 years gathering evidence to prove it was murder. Mrs. Meredith's teacup rattled against its saucer. What does some girl's death 20 years ago have to do with anything? "Everything," Miss Marple replied simply. "You see, Mr. Blackwood didn't return to St. Mary Mead to blackmail people about petty village secrets. He returned as a father, seeking justice for his daughter's death. He believed she was murdered by someone she knew and trusted, someone who had reason to want her silenced permanently." The psychological test. Miss Marple set down her knitting and reached for a small leather portfolio. "Now, as I've been corresponding with the Devon police about Mary Blackwood's death, they still have the case files, including witness statements and evidence that was never made public." The reaction was electric. Several people leaned forward involuntarily, while others seemed to press back into their chairs. Miss Marple noted each response with clinical precision. There were witnesses who saw 2 people on the cliff path that night, Mary and someone in a distinctive red mackintosh. The same style of mackintosh that appears in several photographs from the hotel's guest registry that week. She opened the portfolio and withdrew what appeared to be a photograph. "This is particularly interesting. It shows the hotel guests on the final evening before Mary's death. You can see her quite clearly here and beside her." Miss Marple paused, to letting the tension build. Every eye in the room was fixed on the photograph, and she could feel the collective held breath of people waiting for their fate to be decided. "The curious thing about this photograph," she continued, "is that it shows Mary Blackwood was not alone in Devon. She was accompanied by someone from St. Mary Mead, someone she trusted completely, someone who had convinced her to meet them there under false pretenses." The moment of truth. The silence stretched taut as a violin string. Miss Marple observed each face with the focused attention of a scientist studying specimens, noting the micro-expressions that revealed guilt, fear, and calculation in equal measure. "Of course," she added conversationally, "the most telling evidence isn't in this photograph at all. It's in the lipstick found on the teacup in Mr. Aunt Blackwood's cottage. A very distinctive shade, one that was popular 20 years ago but is quite difficult to find today. The same shade that Mary Blackwood was wearing in this photograph." She looked up from the portfolio, her blue eyes bright with understanding. Someone kept that lipstick all these years, someone who needed it to create a very specific impression when they visited Mr. Blackwood for tea. Someone who understood that the right physical evidence could point suspicion in any direction they chose. The psychological pressure in the room had become almost unbearable. Miss Marple could see the strain on every face, the way people were struggling to maintain their composure while their minds raced through possibilities and calculations. "The question," she said gently, "is not who had the opportunity to kill Mr. Blackwood. The question is who had the knowledge, the patience, and the ruthless intelligence to orchestrate such an elaborate deception. Someone who could manipulate an entire village into confessing to crimes they didn't commit, while hiding their own far more terrible secret." The trap closes. Miss Marple closed the portfolio and picked up her knitting once more. "I believe," she said with quiet certainty, "that tomorrow we shall have our answer. The killer has been very clever, but they've made one crucial error. They've underestimated the power of patient observation and the inevitable moment when even the most carefully constructed mask must slip. She looked around the room one final time, her gaze lingering on each face with the serene confidence of someone who had solved the puzzle completely. Until tomorrow, then, and I do hope everyone sleeps well tonight, though I suspect at least one person will find sleep rather difficult to come by. As the gathering dispersed, the atmosphere in St. Mary Mead had shifted once again. The killer walked among them still, but now they knew that Miss Marple knew. The final game had begun, and tomorrow would bring either the triumph of justice or the desperate act of someone with nothing left to lose. The gentle clicking of Miss Marple's knitting needles continued long into the evening, a peaceful counterpoint to the storm that was about to break over the quiet village of St. Mary Mead. The morning of the final confrontation dawned with deceptive serenity, the kind of peaceful English day that made murder seem impossible. Miss Marple had spent the night in careful preparation, understanding that she would have only one opportunity to expose a killer who had proven themselves capable of extraordinary manipulation and ruthless calculation. She had chosen the church vestry for their meeting, requesting Dr. Haydock's presence under the pretext of discussing the funeral arrangements for Silas Blackwood. The sacred space, with its ancient stones and whispered history of countless confessions, seemed appropriate for what she hoped would be the final revelation in this complex web of deception. The Trap Springs Dr. Haydock arrived precisely on time, his medical bag in hand and his usual expression of professional concern carefully arranged. Miss Marple observed him with the focused attention of someone who had spent decades studying the subtle tells that revealed human nature in all its complexity. "Such a terrible business," he began, settling into the wooden chair she had positioned for him. "Poor Miss Claythorne's confession, Mrs. Meredith's suicide attempt. The village is quite overwrought with guilt and suspicion." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her knitting needles beginning their familiar rhythm. "Though I must confess, Doctor, I find myself puzzled by certain medical details. The timeline, particularly. Your examination placed Blackwood's death much earlier than anyone admitted to visiting him." Haydock's expression remained professionally neutral, but Miss Marple noted the slight tightening around his eyes. "Medical evidence is quite precise in these matters. The body doesn't lie, as we say." "How very true," she agreed. "Bodies tell such interesting stories. Take Mary Blackwood, Archie, for instance, Silas's daughter who died in Devon 20 years ago. The original medical report mentioned symptoms consistent with digitalis poisoning before her fall from the cliff. The effect was immediate and telling. Haydock's hands, which had been resting calmly on his medical bag, tightened almost imperceptibly. His breathing, barely audibly, quickened by fraction. "Ancient history," he said carefully. "Tragic accidents happen, especially during storms." The psychological pressure. Miss Marple continued her gentle assault with the persistence of water wearing away stone. "I've been corresponding with the Devon authorities. They've reopened the case, you know. Modern forensic techniques are quite remarkable. They can detect poison traces even after 20 years in certain conditions." This was, strictly speaking, untrue. But Miss Marple had learned that desperate people often betrayed themselves when confronted with the possibility of scientific evidence they couldn't control or manipulate. "You were doing a temporary posting at the Devon hospital that summer," she continued conversationally. "Such a coincidence that Mary Blackwood should die so near your workplace, and how convenient that you were there to provide medical expertise about her accidental death." Haydock's professional mask was beginning to crack. "What exactly are you suggesting, Miss Marple?" "I'm suggesting that Mary discovered something that threatened your career. Perhaps financial irregularities, perhaps something more personal. You arranged to meet her privately, gave her digitalis to weaken her, and then ensured she fell from that cliff path during the storm. The web unravels. And when her father returned with evidence," Miss Marple pressed on, "you realized your careful secret was about to be exposed. So you invited yourself for tea. Doctors make social calls, after all, and killed him too. But then you did something quite brilliant, Doctor. You used your position as the village's trusted medical authority to orchestrate the most elaborate deception I've ever encountered." She leaned forward slightly, her blue eyes bright with understanding. "You encouraged Miss Claythorne's confession, knowing her devotion to Mrs. Meredith would make her eager to sacrifice herself. You suggested Mrs. Meredith's theatrical suicide attempt, understanding that guilt and fear would make her compliant. You planted evidence against Timothy Reed, so knowing Inspector Slack would pursue the obvious suspect. You even provided the false timeline that made all their supposed visits impossible, creating a maze of contradictions that would keep everyone distracted." Haydock's composure finally shattered. "They were all guilty of something," he said, his voice harsh with suppressed emotion. "Cardew's embezzlement, Melchett's cowardice, Mrs. Meredith's affair with her husband's patient. I simply directed their guilt toward a useful purpose." "And Miss Claythorne? What was her crime, besides loyalty to someone who didn't deserve it?" She knew too much. She'd seen things, heard conversations. She was becoming dangerous. The confession. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly in the silence that followed. "You used the same techniques on them that you used on your patients. The authority of medical knowledge, the manipulation of fear and guilt, the careful psychological pressure applied at precisely the right moments. You turned an entire village into unwitting accomplices in your deception." "It would have worked," Haydock said, his voice hollow with defeat, "if you hadn't interfered with your endless questions and observations." "Perhaps," Miss Marple conceded. "But you made one crucial error, Doctor. You forgot that the most dangerous witness is often the one who appears most harmless. An elderly lady with her knitting, sitting quietly in the corner, watching everything and understanding more than anyone suspects." The sound of footsteps on the stone floor announced Inspector Slack's arrival, precisely timed as Miss Marple had arranged. And the trap had closed with the quiet inevitability of justice finally catching up with someone who had thought themselves cleverer than everyone else in St. Mary Mead. Except, of course, for the elderly lady who sat knitting in sacred spaces and watching human nature reveal itself in all its terrible complexity. As they led Dr. Haydock away, Miss Marple reflected that evil often wore the most trusted faces, and that the greatest crimes were committed not by obvious villains, but by those who used their positions of authority to manipulate others into becoming unwitting participants in their own deception. The final gathering took place in the vicarage drawing room 3 days after Dr. Haydock's arrest, the assembled villagers bearing the subdued air of people who had awakened from a shared nightmare. Inspector Slack sat with his notebook closed. For once, he had no need to take notes. The truth had emerged with crystalline clarity, though its implications would resonate through St. Mary Mead for years to come. Miss Marple occupied her customary chair, her knitting resting quietly in her lap as she surveyed the faces before her. Mrs. Meredith sat pale but composed beside Miss Claythorne, who had gained a quiet strength through her ordeal. Colonel Melchett stood by the window, his military bearing intact but tempered with humility. Thomas Cardew had positioned himself near the door, while Timothy Reed slumped in relief near the fireplace. The complete truth revealed. "I believe you all deserve to understand how completely you were deceived," Miss Marple began, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had unraveled the most complex of human puzzles. Dr. Haydock's manipulation was extraordinary in its scope and psychological sophistication. She paused, choosing her words carefully. 20 years ago, Mary Blackwood was a young nurse who discovered that Dr. Haydock was conducting unauthorized medical experiments during his posting in Devon. When she threatened to expose him, he murdered her, using digitalists to weaken her before ensuring her fall from the cliff path during that terrible storm. The room remained silent, each person grappling with the magnitude of the deception they had lived through. Silas Blackwood spent 2 decades investigating his daughter's death, Miss Marple continued. He returned here not primarily to blackmail the village about petty secrets, but to pressure Dr. Haydock into revealing himself. The public display at the fete was theatre designed to provide cover for his real investigation. Inspector Slack leaned forward. But how did Haydock manage to manipulate everyone so completely? Medical authority is perhaps the most powerful tool of psychological control, Miss Marple explained. After killing Blackwood, invited for tea as a concerned village doctor, Dr. Haydock visited each of you privately. Ostensibly checking on your health during this stressful time, he was actually planting suggestions and manipulating your genuine fears about your real secrets. The mechanism of control. She turned to address each person directly. Miss Claythorne, he convinced you that Mrs. Meredith was guilty and would be convicted unless someone else confessed. Mrs. Meredith, and he suggested your theatrical suicide attempt would create enough confusion to protect everyone. He even arranged for evidence to be planted in Mr. Reed's dustbin, knowing Inspector Slack would pursue that obvious lead. Her needles began their gentle rhythm. He used the same techniques on all of you. The authority of medical knowledge, the manipulation of guilt and fear, the careful psychological pressure applied at precisely the right moments. He transformed you into unwitting participants in his deception. The lipstick on the teacup was his crucial error, she added quietly. He had kept Mary Blackwood's cosmetics as a trophy, a morbid attachment some criminals develop. When he applied it during his visit to Blackwood, the shade was 20 years out of fashion and the application was wrong. Too heavy, now too obvious. Understanding and healing. Mrs. Meredith spoke in a whisper. We were all so desperate to hide our own sins that we became blind to his greater evil. Precisely, Miss Marple agreed. He understood that people carrying genuine guilt will grasp at any solution that promises relief, even confessing to murder. He wasn't threatening you. He was offering you a way out, making you believe your false confessions were acts of nobility rather than symptoms of manipulation. Miss Claythorne found her voice. He said courts were lenient with frightened women, that my confession would save everyone. The student learned from the master, Miss Marple observed. Blackwood used secrets to punish. Dr. Haydock used them to control. But his manipulation was far more sophisticated because it was wrapped in the guise of medical care and concern. The village endures. As the gathering dispersed, each person carried the weight of understanding how easily they had been deceived. Miss Marple remained in her chair, watching them leave with patient comprehension. The young doctor who had replaced Haydock approached her. How did you see through his deception when everyone else was fooled? Miss Marple smiled gently. I've spent a lifetime watching people, Doctor. Dr. Haydock made one crucial error. He forgot that the most dangerous observer is often the one who appears most harmless. He was the only person in the village who never seemed anxious or afraid, despite having as much reason as anyone to fear Blackwood's revelations. That unnatural calm, combined with his immediate certainty about the time of death, told me he knew exactly when Blackwood had died because he had been there when it happened. She resumed her knitting as the afternoon light faded. Evil often hides behind the faces we trust most. The village physician, the beloved teacher, the respected solicitor, these are the people we never suspect because we cannot imagine such betrayal. But human nature is endlessly complex, and the capacity for both great evil and great good exists in the most unexpected places. Outside, St. Mary Mead continued its eternal rhythm. Life went on, carrying within it the eternal tension between trust and suspicion, the face we show the world and the secrets we guard in our hearts. The village would heal, Miss Marple knew, though the scars would linger as reminders that beneath the surface of peaceful lives lay depths that even the most observant among them were still learning to fathom.